I was already at near the train station inside the taxi, ticket in hand, ready to visit my sister. But just as the train neared, something pulled at me. I'd forgotten the will. The original one my husband left behind. I told the driver to turn around. I thought I'd just slip in, grab it, and leave again. But when I opened that door, I didn't hear silence. I heard my son and his girlfriend whispering. And what they said wasn't just careless talk. It was a plan. A quiet, chilling plan I was never meant to hear. Thank you for being here and for taking the time to listen. It means more than you know. If you don't mind, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Go ahead and leave it in the comments. It's always comforting to know who's out there listening. If you've ever trusted someone so deeply that you didn't think twice about leaving your home in their hands, only to return and realize they were planning behind your back the entire time, then maybe you'll understand what I felt in that moment. There's a certain kind of hurt that doesn't come with shouting or slamming doors. It settles quietly in your chest, like dust that's been there for years, and you didn't even notice it until you breathed it in. I wasn't looking to catch anyone. I wasn't spying. I was just coming home for something important. Something that mattered to me because it came from a man who never raised his voice but always made sure I was taken care of. And yet, what I heard when I stepped back into that house didn't sound like care. It sounded like entitlement. It sounded like someone making plans with what didn't belong to them. If you've ever had to sit still and swallow your shock, if you've ever had to act like you didn't hear what you just heard, just to buy yourself a little time to think, then you're not alone. And if any part of my story feels familiar to you, if you've ever had to protect what was already yours, I hope you'll share your story with me. Because sometimes, knowing someone out there understands, that alone can give a person the strength to keep going. My name is Martha. I'm 76 years old, and I've lived in this house longer than I care to count. It's not fancy, but it's home. The kind of home where the floors still creak the way they did the day we moved in, and the kitchen window still fogs up when you boil water too long. I've lived here alone for 22 years now, ever since my husband passed. His name was Robert. He was a quiet man, a postman, the kind who never came home with big stories or loud laughter, but always had something small and kind tucked into his pockets, peppermints, folded notes, or a thoughtful glance. He worked through winter storms and summer heat without complaint, and when he knew his time was running short, he left me something that felt more like a promise than a document. A simple will. Nothing extravagant, just clear instructions to protect what we built together. He used to say, "I may not leave you riches, but I'll make sure you never sleep outside your own door." And he kept that promise. The house was paid off slowly, month by month, year by year. No shortcuts, no loans, just two people doing their best to build something steady. After he passed, I did my best to keep going. I raised our son Daniel, mostly alone. He was my pride at one point, sharp and kind when he was younger. But life has a way of changing people, and over time, something in him hardened. He moved out in his 20s, came back later when things didn't work out the way he planned, and brought his girlfriend, Laura, with him. He said they just needed a place to stay for a while. That was almost a year ago. I didn't ask too many questions. I've always believed that sometimes people need space to find their footing again. But lately, something's been off. They whisper more than they talk. Doors close quickly when I walk down the hall. Laura treats me like I'm more of an obstacle than a person. And Daniel, well, he looks at me, but doesn't really see me anymore. I thought maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was just being sensitive, like people tend to say about women my age. But that day at the train station, when I remembered the will, I felt something in my chest twist in a way I couldn't ignore. Like my body knew something my heart didn't want to admit. So I came back. And what I walked into confirmed everything I was too afraid to say out loud. The platform smelled like old iron and engine smoke, mixed with that faint trace of coffee from the kiosk across the tracks. I had my suitcase beside me, the wheels wobbling slightly from one broken corner, and I kept patting my purse like I was making sure my whole life was still zipped inside it. My sister had just called a few minutes before, said she was making her famous stew, told me not to worry about anything, just to rest when I got there. I remember smiling to myself, thinking how nice it would be to sit on her porch and feel like a guest for once, instead of the caretaker. But as I sat on that wooden bench, looking down at my shoes, it came to me so suddenly, it nearly knocked the air from my chest. The will. Not the copy I'd filed with the lawyer last year, not the notes or the scanned version on that old USB drive, but the original. The one Robert signed with his shaky hand, the one we both initialed together at the bottom, the one I always kept in the kitchen drawer beneath the little stack of birthday cards and grocery coupons. I felt a coldness rise in my throat as I stood up. How could I forget something like that? After all these years guarding it like it was gold, I just left it sitting there, out in the open, with people I wasn't even sure I could trust anymore. I didn't think. I just walked straight back to the line of taxis, dragging that stubborn suitcase behind me, one wheel squeaking like it didn't want to go either. The driver barely asked a question before turning around. I kept whispering to myself, "You're slipping, you're slipping. How could you forget that?" But underneath the panic, there was something else. Something quiet and sharp. A part of me that was thankful. Thankful that whatever it was that tugged at me hadn't let me ignore it, that I turned back in time. That maybe, just maybe, I was about to catch something I was never meant to see. The ride home felt longer than it should have. The roads were quiet, and the driver didn't speak much, which I was grateful for, because my mind was racing, folding and unfolding 100 thoughts all at once. I kept picturing that drawer, the way the paper edges curled just slightly from age, the ink still bold from the day Robert signed it. My heart thudded in my chest with every street we passed, and I held my breath without realizing it as we pulled onto my block. The house looked the same from the outside, peaceful, still, just like it always did. Curtains drawn halfway, one of the upstairs windows cracked open a little, as usual. But the moment I stepped out of that car and walked up to the door, something shifted in me. I noticed it wasn't shut properly. It wasn't wide open, no, just slightly ajar. Enough that I could see the sliver of light running across the hallway floor like a crack in a wall. I froze. That door had a way of clicking loud when it shut, and I always made sure to close it behind me. Always. I didn't knock. I didn't even call out. I just stepped inside. I held my purse close, not because I was scared, but because something in me knew I was walking into something I wasn't meant to hear. The house was quiet in the wrong kind of way, like it was waiting to catch its breath. I was halfway through the hallway when I heard Daniel's voice. It didn't sound like my son. It was low, sharp, coded in something I couldn't quite place at first. Then Laura spoke, and her tone made my skin crawl. "It's not hard, babe," she said with a laugh that didn't belong in my home. "She's old. She doesn't even remember half of what she says." I stopped right where I was, feet frozen, afraid even the creak of a floorboard would give me away. Then he spoke again, and it broke something in me I didn't know was still fragile. "If she dies before signing anything, we're screwed." There was a silence after that, like they were both letting it sink in. I felt like my ears were burning. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I didn't want to hear another word, but my body wouldn't let me turn back just yet. I stood there in my own hallway, hearing my own son speak of me like I was a number on a page, like I was a burden standing between him and something he thought he deserved. My stomach twisted. This was my house. My husband's house. The one we built with every little sacrifice, every missed vacation, every night he came home late and still smiled at me before falling asleep in that old chair by the fireplace. And now, that same house held whispers of betrayal. Not from strangers, not from far-off enemies, but from the very people who sat at my table, who smiled in my face while making quiet plans to erase me. I stood there in that hallway, barely breathing, my hand reaching slowly for the stair rail beside me, just to keep myself steady. I wasn't dizzy, not in the usual sense, but it felt like the floor had shifted beneath me, like the ground I'd walked on for decades no longer recognized my steps. I gripped that rail not because I was weak, but because the weight of what I was hearing made everything inside me want to collapse. My own son, the one I carried through storms and sickness, the one I stayed up for when he had fever as a boy, was now whispering in my home, plotting with a woman I barely knew to push me aside like I was nothing more than an obstacle. Their voices drifted in and out, muffled by the walls, but clear enough to slice through every memory I had of love and sacrifice. Laura's voice, sharp and casual, sent a chill through me that no winter ever managed to bring. "You think she'd even notice if we moved the furniture?" she said, with a laugh so empty it made my skin crawl. "She's slipping. She wouldn't even know if we had her signing something else." Daniel didn't disagree. He didn't defend me. He didn't say she was wrong. He just said, "We just need that signature. And after that, she can go wherever." Wherever. Like I was a package to be dropped off. Like the years I spent making that house feel like a home didn't matter anymore. Like I was just something in the way. I felt my eyes burn, but no tears came out. My chest felt tight, but I refused to let it shake. I wanted to scream. I wanted to burst through that wall and tell them exactly who they were speaking about, but I didn't. I stayed still, hands still gripping that rail, not out of fear, but from the sheer force it took to stay quiet. It was in that silence that I realized something deep and final. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This wasn't a one-time slip of the tongue. This was a plan. Thought out. Agreed upon. Cold. And my son? The same boy who once held my hand crossing the street was willing to sign me away like I was a name on a list. I took one breath, then another, and slowly, as quietly as I came, I stepped backward. One step at a time, heel to toe, like I was walking out of a dream I never wanted to enter. My heart wasn't just breaking, it was changing, hardening in a way that no mother ever wants to admit. I didn't need to hear another word. I had heard enough. And in that moment, I knew exactly what I had to do. Not for revenge, not for drama, but to protect what was already mine. Because if they were going to treat me like I was easy to erase, then they had forgotten exactly who built that house brick by brick, beside a man who loved me until his last breath. And I wasn't about to let them rewrite the ending of my story. I stepped out of that house without a sound, closed the door as gently as my shaking hands would allow, and walked down the porch like I had no weight in my bones, though every part of me felt heavy with something I didn't have a name for yet. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I had turned around, I might have lost control, and I wasn't going to give them that. Not my voice, not my pain, not even a whisper. The taxi driver was still waiting by the curb. Leaned back like he hadn't moved an inch. He looked up, surprised to see me again so soon, but he didn't ask any questions. I got in without a word and told him to take me back to the station. I kept my eyes on the road the whole way, but my thoughts were somewhere else entirely, sorting through old memories, recent doubts, and that one sickening sentence, "We just need that signature." My hands were folded in my lap, but my mind was already 3 steps ahead. Not in fear, not in panic, but in a strange kind of clarity that only shows up when something inside you breaks and refuses to heal the same way. When we reached the train station, I stepped out, nodded politely, and sat down on the far end of the bench, the one where the sun was just starting to touch the metal armrest. I didn't even look at the departures board. My ticket stayed in my purse, untouched. The train came and went, and I didn't budge. Instead, I reached for my phone, scrolled through my old contacts and tapped the one name I never thought I'd need again, Tom. My husband's lawyer. The man who helped us draft that will all those years ago, when Robert was starting to forget the names of his coworkers, but never once forgot mine. I hadn't spoken to Tom in a long while. Not because anything was wrong, just because life moved quietly and steadily after Robert's passing. But today wasn't quiet anymore. The phone rang twice, and he answered. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. My voice came out calm, even, but there was no softness left in it. "Tom," I said, "I need you to activate the clause Robert put in place, the one we never told Daniel about." There was a pause on the other end, but not a confused one. He knew exactly what I meant. We'd written it together, Robert and I, one evening after his diagnosis, when he looked me in the eye and said, "Just in case he ever forgets who you are." That clause was our quiet promise. It gave me the right to change everything if I ever felt threatened or manipulated, especially by family. And I never thought I'd need it. I never wanted to need it. But sitting there, watching trains come and go while the wind tugged at the hem of my coat, I realized something that cut deeper than betrayal. Sometimes, the people you'd step into fire for will strike the match behind your back. And if they thought I was too old to protect myself, then they hadn't been paying attention. Tom didn't need convincing. He said he'd meet me at the house the next day, first thing in the morning, and I could hear the concern in his voice, that quiet professional kind that comes from someone who's seen too many people learn the hard way that love doesn't always stay love. When I returned home that evening, I didn't speak a word to Daniel or Laura. I walked in the same way I had earlier that day, but this time I wasn't trembling. I smiled at them, offered a soft goodnight, and climbed those stairs like nothing had changed, though everything had. I didn't sleep much. Instead, I sat at the edge of my bed with my hands folded and the light from the hallway creeping under the door, planning every step in my mind with the same careful attention I used to pack my son's school lunchboxes when he was little. The next morning, Tom arrived right on time, just after Daniel and Laura left to run one of their usual errands. I'd been watching their patterns lately, memorizing the hours they were gone, how long they spent out, how many bags Laura came back with that she never said thank you for. We sat at the kitchen table, me, Tom, and the notary he brought along. No one raised their voice. No one moved too fast. We took out the original will, and I read it aloud, line by line, before signing the updated clause. An addendum we had already written long ago, one that granted me full authority to redirect everything in the estate if I ever felt under duress. The house, the savings, the land behind the garden, even the old safety deposit box Robert kept in town, all of it. I held the pen steady. I spoke each word with the same tone I used when I used to read bedtime stories, slow and full, because I wanted every syllable to be remembered. Then, before they left, I asked Tom to do one more thing. I wanted to record a video, just me, just my voice. No edits, no polish. I sat right here at this same table, looked directly at the lens, and spoke the truth. I explained what the will said, what Robert and I had agreed to, and why I had updated the documents. I told the story in full, not to shame, not to humiliate, but to leave no room for lies to take root later. When I finished, I smiled. Not a big smile, just the kind that comes when you finally stop pretending that you're safe with people who've already decided what your worth is. I saved the video in 3 places, locked the physical copy in a drawer they didn't know existed, and handed Tom a duplicate. They thought I'd forgotten how to protect myself. They thought I was too soft, too tired, too slow, but I wasn't confused. I wasn't broken. I was just quiet. Quiet enough to see how far they'd go. Quiet enough to know that sometimes the best way to fight back is not to raise your voice, but to raise the stakes. And I did. Without a single warning. I knew I couldn't afford to move too fast. Not yet. So I went back to my routine like nothing had happened. The same warm greetings in the morning, the same soft smile at dinner, and that gentle nod when I passed them in the hallway. I even offered them tea that evening, just like I used to. I stood in the kitchen, humming low, letting the kettle hiss and the sugar bowl sit open on the counter, acting like I had all the time in the world. Laura sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, barely looking up when I asked how many sugars she wanted. Daniel said he didn't want tea, just water. That part stung more than I expected, because he always used to say I made tea better than anyone else, even if all I did was drop a bag in hot water and stir it with the same spoon I used for the honey. I handed her the cup, sat across from them, and talked about simple things, how my sister's stew would have been too spicy anyway, how the neighbor's cat kept climbing the garden fence. They laughed, nodded, joined in like nothing had changed, and I kept that smile on my face, steady and light, while in the back of my mind, I kept track of every word, every glance, every shift in their voices. Later that night, while they were upstairs talking with the door half shut, I took my phone and began to quietly record voice notes. Just my thoughts. What I saw, what I heard, how their words changed when they thought I wasn't around. I saved each one with the date and time and backed them up to the email account Tom helped me create for this very reason. I also wrote it all down in a small journal I kept hidden behind the pantry wall, right behind the old pickle jars no one ever touches. My handwriting isn't as neat as it used to be, but I made sure every word was clear. I drew arrows, underlined phrases, kept it all straight. If anyone ever questioned my state of mind, I wanted them to read that journal and know I was paying attention. I also started using the old camera Robert left behind, the one that still works if you charge it long enough. I set it up in the living room facing the kitchen, not hidden, but not obvious either. Just angled enough to catch faces, to hear tones. It wasn't paranoia, it was protection. Because not long after I started collecting all this, Daniel came into my room one afternoon, holding his phone like he was checking something important, and said, "Hey, Mom, I was talking to a doctor friend of Laura's, just about some things I've noticed lately. He says it might be time for a checkup, just memory stuff. Nothing serious, just routine." I looked at him, still holding the sweater I was folding, and asked, "What kinds of things have you noticed?" He hesitated, then gave me that half smile that doesn't reach his eyes anymore, and said, "You've just been forgetting stuff here and there. Dates, where things are. It's probably nothing, but Laura thought it would be good to get ahead of it, you know?" I nodded slowly, told him I'd think about it. And as he walked out of the room, I sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor for a long time. That's when I knew. This wasn't just about a signature anymore. This was about control. About erasing my voice before I could use it. But they had no idea how far ahead I already was. They thought they were building a case, but what they didn't know was I'd already started writing the ending. Line by line, in my own words, with my own pen, and no one was going to take that away from me. Not now. Not ever. A week passed, maybe a little more. I kept doing what I had to do, smiling when I had to, cooking what they liked, listening closely without letting it show. But inside me, the storm was gathering quietly, not to destroy, but to clear the air. I knew I couldn't let it continue. I couldn't wait for them to make the next move. I had to speak on my own terms, with everything prepared and nothing left to chance. So one morning, I told them both I wanted to have a talk. I made it sound gentle, called it a little family meeting to discuss the estate, just some updates and papers to go over. Daniel looked suspicious at first, but Laura, always pretending to be the voice of calm, said it was a good idea. That afternoon, I set the table with tea and warm biscuits, just like I used to when Robert was alive and we had real family moments around that same table. I wore the same sweater I wore the day he signed the will. Not because I thought they'd notice, but because I did. When they came down, I had already asked Tom to come by, just for support. I introduced him like it was casual, as if it were nothing more than a quick review, nothing formal. I didn't want to alarm them, not yet. I offered them seats, poured the tea, and smiled the way I've learned to, steady, unreadable. Then I said, "Before we go over anything, there's something I'd like you to hear." I reached into my purse and pulled out the small recorder. I pressed play. At first there was just a bit of static, then the sound of their voices, clear as day. Laura's tone sharp, Daniel's voice low and calculating. That sentence I can never forget echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls like a bullet. "If she dies before signing anything, we're screwed." Their faces froze. Laura's smile vanished. Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came out at first. The recording continued, line after line, revealing everything they had said while they thought I was gone. I didn't flinch. I just watched them listen. When the audio stopped, the silence that followed was heavier than anything I've felt in years. Finally, Daniel found his voice, but it came out jagged and too fast. "You were spying on me? On us?" I kept my eyes on him, my hands folded neatly on the table, and said without raising my voice, "No, I was listening to the boy I raised turn into a stranger." I didn't blink. I didn't soften the words. I let them land exactly as they should. He looked away first. That's when I knew he wasn't shocked about what he said. He was only shocked that I heard it. Laura tried to speak, offered a weak excuse about stress and misunderstanding, but I held up my hand and said, "I don't want explanations. I want truth. And the truth is, you both sat at my house, drank my tea, slept under my roof, and made plans to erase me." I turned to Tom and nodded, and he placed a folder on the table. Inside were the documents I had signed, the video I had recorded, the journal entries printed out and notarized. Everything was dated, time-stamped, and witnessed. I looked back at Daniel and said, "You thought I forgot who I was. But I never did. I was just waiting to see who you'd become when you thought no one was looking." The room stayed silent, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled, because it says everything. And in that moment, I didn't feel broken. I felt clear, I felt steady. I felt like I had finally taken my voice back. Not with shouting, not with anger, but with truth. And nothing, absolutely nothing, is louder than that. Tom didn't speak right away. He waited, just like I did, letting the weight of the truth settle into that room like dust after a storm. Daniel sat back in his chair, eyes darting between me and the folder in front of him, trying to figure out how much I knew, how far ahead I had planned. Laura crossed her arms, tried to pretend it didn't matter, but her foot kept tapping under the table, and her eyes couldn't stay still. When Tom finally opened the folder and laid out the documents, his voice was steady and clear. He looked at Daniel and said, "You've been removed from the will. That change was made 3 years ago, long before any of this took place." I saw it hit him like a blow to the chest. His whole posture changed. He leaned forward, then back, then forward again, like he couldn't decide whether to argue or disappear. "What do you mean?" he said, his voice cracking a little. "You can't just take me out of the will. I'm her son." Tom didn't blink. He slid a copy of the updated documents across the table and said, "Your mother has the legal right to distribute her estate as she sees fit, and as of now everything, the house, the land, the funds tied to it, has been placed in a private trust, earmarked for a women's refuge center. The paperwork has already been filed." I could see Laura's face drain of color. Daniel turned to her so fast it made the teacups rattle. "You said she'd never do anything like this?" he snapped. "You said she'd be too scared to change anything." She didn't answer right away, just shook her head and muttered, "I didn't think she had it in her." And that's when I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I looked at both of them, Daniel, the boy I once carried in my arms, and Laura, who had worn a smile like a mask for far too long. And I said, "This house may not be mine for long, but neither will it ever be yours." I walked over to the window then, looked out at the old oak tree Robert planted the year Daniel was born. That tree still stood tall, roots deep, branches reaching. I turned back to them and said, "I built this home with a man who loved quietly but deeply. We saved for every brick. We sacrificed for every coat of paint. And we didn't do all that so someone could walk in years later and try to claim it with a forged smile and a clever plan." Daniel tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand. "You made your choices, and now I've made mine. You showed me who you are when you thought I wasn't listening. And I believe you." His eyes started to water then, but I didn't feel pity. I felt peace. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I needed to protect what was sacred. Not just the house, but the story that lived inside its walls. The story of love, of resilience, of two people who never had much, but gave everything to build something lasting. And if I couldn't pass that on to someone who truly respected it, then I'd rather give it to women who knew what it meant to start over. Women who understood what it meant to be ignored, used, underestimated, and still rise. That was the final page of this chapter. And I wrote it in ink no one could erase. The house felt different once they were gone. Lighter. Quieter in a way that didn't ache. The air seemed to settle better through the rooms, the floors didn't creak with tension anymore, and the silence wasn't something I feared. It became something I welcomed. I remember that first morning after the dust settled. I woke up before the sun, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders, brewed a fresh pot of tea, and stepped out to the porch with my old ceramic cup in hand, the one with the crack near the handle that I still refused to throw away. I sat in my chair, leaned back, and listened to the world breathe. The wind moved gently through the trees. Birds called to one another in that early, hopeful way they do when the day hasn't been touched yet. I just sat there, sipping my tea, letting the warmth settle in my chest, and the stillness hold me like a friend who didn't ask for anything but presence. Laura left first. She packed her things in silence, didn't say a word to me, just looked down every time we crossed paths. It didn't surprise me. People like her don't know how to face the truth unless they can spin it in their favor. And in this house, that door was now closed. Daniel stayed a little longer, dragging his feet, asking questions that didn't need answers. He wanted to know if there was still a way to fix things. to make it right. But not once did he apologize, not for the words, not for the betrayal, not for treating me like an object to be shifted aside. I listened, nodded, then walked away. He left 2 days later, took the last of his things, and didn't look back. I didn't expect him to. Sometimes people don't return to the places they've burned. I didn't cry when they left, not even a tear. I had done all my grieving while they were still under my roof. The day they walked out was not a day of loss, it was a day of restoration. I got my home back, I got my breath back, and slowly I began to live again. There's a little girl across the street, maybe 7 or 8, who started waving at me from her window every morning. Her name is Ruby, and she started visiting a few times a week with her grandmother's permission. She brings stories, little drawings, and more questions than any adult ever dares to ask. She sits with me while I water the plants, helps me hang laundry, even asked me once if I'd ever met a real fairy. I told her yes, and that they don't always wear wings. Sometimes they wear old slippers and keep cookies in their apron pockets. She giggled like it was the best thing she'd ever heard. And in her laughter, I found something I hadn't heard in my house for a long time. Joy that wasn't pretending to be something else. A few weeks after everything was finalized, I went to visit the women's shelter that now owned the deed to this place. Not to give a speech or be recognized, but just to sit among women who knew what it felt like to be disregarded, unseen, underestimated. I offered to help wherever they needed, folding clothes, sorting food, listening without interrupting. I don't have strength in my hands like I used to, but I still know how to hold someone's story without letting it fall apart. And in those quiet hours I felt something return to me. A purpose that didn't come from giving everything to someone who only wanted more. I couldn't save my son from greed. I tried. I gave him love, time, patience, trust. But sometimes love isn't enough to fight what people let into their hearts. Still, just because I couldn't save him doesn't mean I can't save someone else. Maybe not with money or grand gestures, but with presence, with listening, with steady hands, and a steady heart. That's how I chose to start over. Not with anger, not with sorrow, but with purpose. Because even after everything, I still believe that what we give in truth, we get back in peace. And I chose peace, not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind that comes from finally being heard. If someone has ever made you feel small in a home you built with your own hands, if you've ever been treated like a problem to be solved instead of a person to be loved, then I hope you'll share your story with me in the comments. You're not alone. And if this story touched something in you, if it made you remember, reflect, or feel seen, then go ahead and subscribe. I'll be right here, telling the kind of stories they hoped would stay buried. Real stories, quiet strength, hard truths. And if you're still listening, it means you're part of something now. So stay with me. There's more to come. Thank you for watching.